Hello and welcome to Buying into the Future, where we discuss all things public procurement. Today, we'll be discussing a very serious matter that faces everyone, I think, involved in public procurement, the issue of due diligence. How do public buyers ensure that goods and services they buy come from suppliers who observe human rights and labor rights, especially when supply chains have become so complex in a globalized market? So I'm happy to say that with us today, we have three guests who have a great deal of experience in this area, both in terms of policy and practice, and who have kindly agreed to discuss the current state of play and the future of due diligence. And so to get things going, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves now. And going across my screen, Anna, please, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Anna Lupi. I'm a legal and policy officer at the European Commission, working in the Directorate General dealing with industrial policy and internal market. And at the moment, I work in the responsible business conduct unit, dealing mainly with the forced labor regulation, but I have a history of working for 10 years on public procurement and in particular socially responsible public procurement.
Moving across, Jonathan, if you'd like to say a few words about yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Jonathan. I'm coordinator of Ghent Fair Trade, a partnership between the city of Ghent and Oxfam. And as part of my job, I'm supporting the procurement team of the city of Ghent in their efforts to buy more ethical and sustainable products.
Great, Jonathan. Thank you very much for joining us today. Last but by no means least, we have Kate. Kate, a few words about yourself, if you would, please.
Hi, Steve. I'm Kate Sullivan. I'm Director of Affiliate Engagement at Electronics Watch. The Affiliate Engagement team is the part of our organization that supports public buyers to implement responsible procurement and promote due diligence in their supply chains.
Anna, I would like to start with you, if I may. And if you could just outline for us what the primary challenges are that you currently see facing EU contracting authorities in making sure that human rights and labor rights in supply chains are respected when procurers are looking for goods and services. And could you give a few words about how you think those challenges might be overcome?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And this is a question that we discuss very often with experts and stakeholders. And actually, we discussed it very recently with some experts from academia and NGOs with a lot of experience in public procurement. And I have no hard data to prove this, but our impression based on the discussions we have across the EU is that there are not so many legal challenges that stop public authorities from doing human rights due diligence in the context of public procurement. But their challenges are very practical, and they relate mostly to a lack of capacity and resources. It's a really big investment in terms of expertise and time to look at the supply chain of the products or the services that you are purchasing as a public authority. Very often, public buyers don't necessarily have the in-house expertise to deal with human rights issues or with workers' rights. And the time is a particularly valuable resource also because you don't have to just spend it as a public buyer in the needs assessment and in the risk assessment that will lead you to identify what are the specific human rights issues you might be dealing with in the specific procurement and how to tackle them in the procurement phase. But also, there's a lot of time spent and a lot of resources spent in contract management if you want to actually make sure that those issues are tackled. And in particular, there's a lot of engagement with the contractor that needs to be taken care of. And of course, we are talking, when we talk about public procurement, of a tool which is at the disposal of public authorities, but is also a tool where normally public buyers are under a lot of time pressure. One of the specific challenges, of course, of human rights due diligence in general, and this is particularly true for public buyers who have such a big shortage of resources, is the availability of supply chain data and supplier knowledge. I mean, this is an issue that we ourselves will be facing in some of the areas of sustainabilities which we have regulated on in the last few years. So I imagine for public buyers to have access to data, to have some transparency on the supply chain will be extremely tricky. And frankly speaking, the only way I can see these issues being addressed, not solved, because they are very complex, is for public buyers to increasingly cooperate and work together and share knowledge, share strategies that they have used, potentially also come up with model clauses, and also share information on their respective suppliers, because very often public buyers tend to have the same suppliers across the EU, especially in some sectors.
Kate, if I could turn to you for a similar question. In your experience of working and advising and supporting public buyers, what are the main challenges that you have seen nowadays for EU contracting authorities? Do you have any ideas on how these challenges could be overcome?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're gonna pick up on some common themes here between what Anna has said and what I'll share. And I imagine Jonathan will touch on some similar points. There's a lot of interrelated challenges, and maybe I can speak to a few of those or highlight a few of them. The transparency gap that Anna just mentioned is a real issue. Obviously, it's important that public authorities are able to monitor the requirements on their contract. And that means that they need to know where the things that they're purchasing and the services that they're purchasing are coming from. And while they can often get information to the country of origin, for instance, for final assembly in the electronic sector, getting beyond that, tier 2, tier 3, let alone the really far upstream tiers like extraction and processing, it's really difficult. So that's one challenge. But if we look at kind of a more meta level, I think the extent to which there will be an enabling policy environment is an interesting question. We've heard a lot lately about the term simplification, which I think in principle is a great idea. You don't want to spend a lot of time working on things that are unnecessarily complex. But at the same time, we see that term being used as a guise for deprioritizing and reducing the scope of corporate accountability. And that can trickle down for contracting authorities. It can mean that there's a shift in direction internally that translates into them being asked to spend less time on due diligence related activities, getting less institutional support, things like tools and trainings for assessing and mitigating and preventing human rights harms. And obviously, it relates to the question that Anna raised about resource constraints. Resource constraints aren't anything new. I think for a long time, public buyers have been under a lot of pressure to do a lot with very little. But in terms of due diligence, this is one aspect of a lot of complex work that they need to look at. If they're not being allotted appropriate time, if there aren't people with the right expertise who can give their time to doing this correctly, it's not going to move forward. I guess I would mention two other challenges, which are fragmentation, and this relates also to the question of cooperation that Anna raised. Among those EU contracting authorities who do address social and environmental issues via their procurements, a lot of them do so without consideration for what others are doing. That has a lot of different effects. Obviously, they're sometimes recreating the wheel, which isn't a very good use of their limited time, but it also means that you're sending different, sometimes competing signals to the market. And for the bidders who are competing for these contracts, they're being pulled in different directions. And the last thing I think is that for many contracting authorities who haven't been doing due diligence work before, they're afraid to get started with the work because they're overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. And so they let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Instead of doing something small and building that practice over time, they do nothing. So I think those are the challenges that I would highlight. In terms of how to address them, I think the easiest thing with constraints on time is to limit the scale of the work that you're doing to the team size and available time. And that sounds very simple, but it's easier said than done. Focusing on doing a few things really, really well and really consistently can have a lot of impact. And finding ways of communicating the need for and the value of this work. What we've seen in the work that we've done with public authorities is that when they have leadership internally who doesn't recognize the value of this in relation to other priorities, sometimes raising awareness about just how prevalent the issues are and busting some of the myths that are out there can be really useful in helping to justify spending time on these issues. I think, Anna, you mentioned also model contract clauses, and obviously that's something that Electronics Watch has. We have model contract clauses and a code of conduct, as do other organizations. I'm thinking of the ETI base code, the Responsible Contracting Project. All of these are efforts to harmonize standards. So I think to the extent that public authorities can make use of these free resources and also participate in networks and initiatives that promote collaboration and harmonization, I think that would be a really good way forward.
We'll turn now to Jonathan for your experience in the city of Ghent. A similar question, basically, what challenges in your environment are you facing ensuring that procurement practices promote and protect workers' rights?
Anna and Kate already mentioned a lot. I think time and means are probably always the biggest challenge, but maybe more from a practical perspective within the city of Ghent. I think we have been getting a lot of means from political level because they value sustainable public procurement for very much for quite a long time now. So there is a bit of capacity here, but still we face a lot of challenges. And I think one of the big ones is the fear for a lack of supplier participation. So there's always this concern that stricter criteria or asking for stricter criteria will lead to having only a few bids or even none. And scaring off suppliers. That creates this tension between ambitions and the reality in a way. And then there's this temptation to switch to lower criteria or easier to get labels. But of course, from my perspective, from policymakers' perspective, the risk of fair washing or greenwashing is then far too big. Another very practical challenge is monitoring. We have seen that systematically tracking and reporting on what is actually bought in framework contracts is not that easy for a local authority, even for Ghent that is working quite hard on this topic. And then that makes it hard to see if the final purchases actually reflect the ambitions that we put forward. I think there's a lot of technicalities that public buyers would recognize. I think one thing is that quite often, for practical reasons, products or the demand for products are bundled in one tender, and then automatically you're limiting the amount of suppliers that will put an offer forward, and thus limit the options for sustainable products in this offer. And in general, I think the type of contract is always the biggest factor. For services, cleaning, for example, it's quite easy to include very concrete measures for working well-being, for example, and we can also actually go and check them. But then when we're talking about goods with a long international supply chain, like Anna and Kate already touched, it becomes more and more complicated for us to trace where things come from and to go and influence sub-suppliers. So in general, working with local suppliers then is easier than with multi-tier global supply chains, but at the same time, larger international suppliers often have a more mature due diligence systems in place. So that makes it then in certain ways easier to work with bigger companies. So voilà, it's a combination of several things, and it's actually also depending on which kind of products you're talking of.
So, Jonathan, in terms of practicalities, in terms of actually forming contracts with suppliers, how are social responsibility and human rights due diligence incorporated into your procurement processes? Do you have, for example, any tools or resources that you use?
Yeah, I think at Ghent, we really try to treat social responsibility and human right due diligence as something continuous. So not a box you tick once and then forget about. And my team is working very closely with the procurement team, and together we look at all the product groups of products that are being bought by the city every year, once or twice, and then we decide where we need to be more hands-on. So for categories, we then prioritize. We build in fair trade or human rights criteria straight into the tenders. And at this point, that applies to about 90% of what we buy. So across the board, almost every tender includes a special condition on human rights to avoid things like illegal employment, unpaid wages, but also compliance with national and international labor standards, including the ILO core conventions. And at the same time, bidders have to accept our behavioral code, which is based on ISO 26000 and those same ILO standards. So the commitment there is already from the moment they start submitting their offer. For areas where we know there is a higher risk, like textiles or natural stone or electronics, or even certain food products, we add extra layers of due diligence. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really tailor-made to the sector. For example, in electronics or ICT, we are a member of Electronics Watch, so we know Kate quite well, which gives us an independent monitoring and direct insight into working conditions in global electronic factories, something we, of course, could never do on our own. For natural stone, we are part of an initiative called the True Stone Initiative, which supports responsible quarrying and production. And for workwear, we use a more hands-on improvement trajectory that we developed ourselves over the years. And lastly, for food products like cocoa or coffee, where the risks are all well known, we simply require the most credible and strict certification scheme like fair trade. So depending on the product group, we try to combine general social requirements with sector-specific tools and partnerships. And that way, we try to match the level of due diligence with the level of risk and not try to apply the same checklist for everything.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. Some very interesting points. Anna, can I come to you? So Anna, what role do you see the EU playing in promoting global standards and best practices for human rights due diligence and the protection of workers' rights in supply chains?
Thank you for the question, Steve. I think it's a very vast array of actions that we could talk about here. Obviously, there's a lot that we do in terms of international cooperation, but I think one of the major powers that we have as a European Union is regulation. And as you know, we've recently adopted plenty of legislation dealing with sustainability in European markets. In particular, we have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Forced Labor Regulation, which is supposed to ban products that are made with forced labor from entering the EU market, the EU Deforestation Regulation, also fighting deforestation globally. And some of this legislation at the moment is undergoing a process of simplification. So we are kind of awaiting the outcome of the negotiations between the legislators to see exactly how what it will look like. But the whole idea behind this legislation is precisely to promote certain standards and certain practices. And of course, and the main idea is to protect workers in supply chains, but also globally populations which are, of course, suffering from climate change, which of course includes us, but a lot of other individuals outside Europe. And I just want to mention also that the public procurement reform is on the horizon for mid-2026. And we are working on some studies to analyze how procurement can be used strategically to support responsible business conduct, social responsibility, and sustainability more in general. But of course, this work on legislation, although it's very relevant and it's about setting standards, needs to be complemented with accompanying measures. And in a way, these accompanying measures are just as important for our public buyers, because many of them are eager to do more than the bare minimum that we set with the legislation, and because some suppliers will not be captured by this legislation. So in public procurement, I just want to mention two things that we try to do, which is to provide guidance. I mean, we have guidance on socially responsible public procurement, which talks about, in particular, also human rights due diligence, and a number of best practices that we've tried to disseminate. But maybe more importantly, we have a number of communities of practice. And the idea for these communities of practice is that we have public buyers share their experience with tricky procurement issues in the field of sustainability, and share also their market intelligence to strategize a little bit together on how to leverage their market power. And by that, I mean that the landscape in Europe when it comes to procurement is very fragmented. We have over 250,000 public buyers. So when they want to make the difference on their own, for instance, on human rights due diligence, their market share, what they purchase, and their investment might seem quite small. But when they put together their efforts to achieve a specific objective and they use the same strategies and the same approaches, that power multiplies. So that's what we try to do with a number of different communities of practice, and some of them are focusing on human rights issues. I'm thinking of the community of practice working on solar panels, the Circular and Fair ICT Pact, and the social public procurement community of practice.
If we could get down to kind of practicalities and real life scenarios, do you have any success stories or case studies where your support has led to tangible positive impacts for workers in electronics supply chains?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got several different examples, but I can point to a case that was resolved last year. And the reason why I think it's worth highlighting is both because it was so long and hard fought, but also because there was tremendous direct engagement between public authorities and their suppliers, in addition to other remediation channels that we pursued. And this concerned a component supplier in Malaysia that was supplying to three major brands in relation to printers and photocopiers. What we identified through our monitoring, which I think in its earliest phase actually started in 2021 and then continued into 2022, among other things, was that there was unfair recruitment practices that were taking place there. In particular, migrant workers were being charged recruitment fees in order to get their jobs that were very excessive, above what was legal. And this was leading to a question of debt bondage and a risk of forced labor, among other things. And what really brought this case to a head after the initial monitoring was undertaken was that a whistleblower among the workers who spoke up about the recruitment abuses and wanted to see these addressed was then forcibly repatriated. And I say that very politely because really what it was is he was kidnapped from his dormitory. His phone was taken away. He was not told where he was going. He was held overnight in a locked room and then put on a plane the next day. And this really, the level of severity of that particular incident and the protest from the other workers who were concerned about his whereabouts that followed meant that the brands who were sourcing from this company, they really escalated it quickly. And that ensured that the dialogue that was already in place about the monitoring findings was able to proceed. So in addition to working with the Responsible Business Alliance on behalf of all of our affiliated public buyers, we were supporting our members to engage directly with their suppliers to put pressure on them to ensure that the factory in question was cooperating with the investigation. And the success story here was that of those who had paid recruitment fees, all of them were eventually reimbursed for those. So that's 203 eligible migrant workers at that factory. And the individual who was forcibly repatriated was given additional compensation. Something else that's really interesting about this case is that two things, I suppose. In addition to the financial compensation, which is a more common form of reparation, the factory management actually issued a formal apology to workers. And I think that's something that we don't see so often, and it's easy to brush away as being less important. But for individuals who've been profoundly wronged, it can be really, really important to have that level of acknowledgement beyond the other reparations that they might be entitled to. And the second important aspect of this case is that it actually triggered reparations being provided to workers at a second factory that was owned by the same company. So what this case did is it led to further scrutiny on other factories by that company and triggered a secondary investigation that resulted in 178 migrant workers at a second factory being reimbursed. So this is a really good example of how public buyers are using evidence of human rights violations and allegations in their supply chain to put pressure on those who have leverage to affect change, and also how collaborating together and working collectively has been able to influence the situation.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I think it's a wonderful example of how serious these issues actually are, especially for the people kind of at the end of the chain, as it were. And I'm very happy to hear that it had such a successful resolution. Jonathan, in your experience, any case studies, success stories maybe that you'd like to share with us?
Maybe to start, especially with Kate being here, I do want to stress that our experience with Electronic Swatch has been really positive, and I actually consider that partnership a best practice on its own. But maybe I can give another example from a different sector. So one example that really stands out is the work we've done on workwear. Over the years, we've turned it into a kind of step-by-step model that helps suppliers gradually improve transparency and working conditions in their supply chain. So the idea is not to punish suppliers or reject suppliers, but to guide them and build capacity. So back in 2018, we created a toolbox for public buyers, which was like a really practical guide that helps you understand the social risk in textile supply chain and how to work with suppliers on corrective actions. It recognizes that not every supplier starts at the same level, and it's designed to help them grow over time. In our tenders, suppliers commit right from the start, as I said earlier, by submitting an offer. They are accepting a behavioral code based on the ISO 26000 and the ILO convention, and they agree in this specific tender, they agree to join us in this improvement trajectory. So once the contract is running, we follow a 3-step approach. First, you have the engagement. Suppliers commit to continuous improvement. Then there's transparency. They complete the baseline questionnaire and provide an independent verified risk report, like from EcoVadis or Fair Wear Foundation or SA1000, things like that. And they do that at the beginning and then every year. And then finally, action. Within 3 months of those reports, they give us a corrective action plan for the coming year. So sometimes it's their own plan, sometimes it's a plan validated by an external auditor. Throughout the contract, we keep regular contact, so mostly through meetings with the suppliers. And the focus in those contacts is always to keep dialogue going and to improve the way of working. So there's no, it's not focused on sanctions. It's really like a last resort, but they're not the start of the conversation, of course. In case transparency becomes an issue, we do have the right to contact sub-suppliers and organize external audits. So we did build in that security, but normally we try to work in cooperation with the suppliers. So that model really helped us to push a bit, to nudge suppliers forward, even in a very complex supply chain like the one that is textiles.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the importance of contractual obligations and monitoring, I think, are absolutely vital in these situations. Jonathan, I am going to stay with you just for a second, because whenever we talk about improvements in public buying, be it sustainability or serious issues like this, I'm always curious about how one finds the balance between what you want to achieve, in this case, protection of workers' rights, etc., with other procurement considerations such as cost and quality and delivery times, etc. From what you've seen there in Ghent, how easy is it to balance all these considerations?
Yeah, that's a very important topic of conversation between us from a human rights perspective, but also policy, people working on policy of environmental topics, for example, and then indeed cost, quality, delivery. Especially when budgets get tight, the conversations get more interesting, I would say. But at Ghent, we try to approach it in a very holistic and practical way. So on one side, of course, we use the meat principle, the most economically advantageous tender, which already helps a lot. It's good that it exists. And that stresses that price is not the only thing, even though it's important. Quality, environmental aspects, social standards, it's all seen as part of the overall value. And trying to look at it that way avoids a bit a race to the bottom where the cheapest offer automatically wins. We also take a risk-based approach. So in high-risk categories like textiles or like electronics, we set stronger social requirements because that's also where the biggest impact is. And then for lower-risk categories, we scale it back so we don't overburden suppliers or make procurement unnecessarily complicated. And then another thing is we try to look at the long-term value. So a supplier who is transparent and who has solid due diligence system is often also more reliable on the long term. So they have generally fewer disruptions, better quality, more stable supply chains. And sometimes they're slightly more expensive, but then reliability and reduced risks often save money over time. And then lastly, we work with suppliers. So if something goes wrong, if there's gaps, we don't immediately penalize them. We start with dialogue and corrective action plans, and sanctions are possible, but of course they're a last resort. So it's like that's the way we look at it. And in the end, if you look at it that way, workers' rights don't really compete with cost or quality. It's more like a part of how we define the overall value of the product.
Okay, thank you very much. Turning back to you, Kate, for my final question. It has been mentioned several times in our discussion today, this idea of capacity building for public authorities, which is very much part of what you do. So if you had like a wish list of what you would wish for public authorities in terms of the type of support that they should get, what would be on your wish list for capacity building?
That is such a hard question to answer succinctly, but I can think of, there are the big picture things, which is that there are investments in expertise in-house and training available, but that they have a clear mandate to work on these issues. But I think if we look at different stages of the procurement process, the needs, there's maybe specific needs that we could talk about in terms of capacity. Where you have authorities who are including requirements in their tenders through the criteria, they often ask smart questions, but they don't necessarily know how to evaluate the responses that they get back. And I think support for understanding what credible objective evidence is, what to ask for, what to look for, is particularly important. And I think this is going to become increasingly important in the context of AI, where you're going to be getting really well formulated answers, but perhaps needing to be looking for more specific examples that make it objectively verifiable. Another aspect of support that could be needed or something I would put on my wish list is helping public authorities understand how to develop scoring schemes that give adequate weight to the social criteria that they're including, such that those have some kind of bearing on the outcome of the procedure. We see a lot of well-intended contracting authorities who are loading up the questions on the social side, and that has the impact of diluting the value of each of those responses, or that they're including just one question, but perhaps it's not weighted heavily at all, and it has no bearing at all whatsoever on what happens. I think on the contract management side, that's where most of the support needs are. And I love Jonathan's answers because they really point to what we see as best practice in terms of focusing on dialogue and continuous improvement and collaboration, because responsibility for due diligence in the supply chain is shared, obviously, between all of the supply chain actors. And it needs to be done in an inclusive way with stakeholders like rights holders and trade unions. But the capacity gaps that we tend to see are around the approach. So first, I think a lot of authorities have this kind of command and control, or very black and white, zero tolerance approach, whereby any kind of allegation or concern that's identified could jeopardize the business relationship in the contract. And that doesn't create an incentive for suppliers to be open and honest and transparent. So I think having support to transition away from that type of system toward one that is like what Jonathan described would be one area. And another one is on how to build an effective dialogue with suppliers on due diligence and human rights. That can seem really intimidating, especially if you don't have experience or expertise. And also for the suppliers, if your account manager has never been asked questions about human rights before, they may feel uncomfortable answering. So starting small and getting support for identifying, how would you build this up over time? What would you want to do to create a trust-based relationship so that when issues are identified, nobody's shocked, nobody panics, but it feels more like part of a regular process and building on this commitment to improve together. And the last thing, I think, coming back to the evidence question and knowing how to evaluate what you're getting back would be support for learning from what others are doing. So that means giving public authorities and the relevant functions time to participate in forums with others, whether those are networks or programs like ours. There's so many out there that are really fantastic. You have the International Working Group on Ethical Public Procurement. You have Electronics Watch. You have Procura Plus. You have the Circular and Fair ICT Pact, just to name a few within electronics that are relevant in that sector. There's so many good examples of what could be done, but people don't have time or the mandate to join those and learn from others, and that puts them at a disadvantage. So I think my wish list, I guess that's kind of all over the map, but those would be some things that I would love to see to help public buyers to do this work better.
Jonathan, you wanted to say something?
It's very valuable what Kate just listed, and especially the sharing and encouraging sharing experiences by the EU. There's so many people working on public procurement and ethical public procurement around the EU, and most of them are working on their own, doing great work. I'm thinking of the risks assessment done by the Norwegian government, but also the work of Electronics Watch, indeed the International Working Group on ethical public procurement. Sharing this information with local authorities or translating it into English, for example, would already make a big difference, because a lot of the information, for example, that we gather in Ghent is in Dutch, so it's not easily usable for other authorities around the EU. So I think, I totally agree with what Kate just listed.
Thank you very much. It's nice to end on a note of agreement, always. So with that, we're going to wrap up today's podcast. All that remains is for me to thank very much our guests today for their time and their insights, and for clarifying in a very, very strong way what a serious issue this is. And to our listeners, thank you very much for joining us. Please remember to check out our playlist of podcasts. There's a number of great guests discussing a wide range of procurement-related topics. So with that, I shall thank everyone here and everyone out there for joining us today, and say goodbye to you for now.